War and Revolution, section Saturn and the Dynamic of Historical Crises. There is perhaps a point where Furet registers the unsustainability of the black and white contrast between the history of France and the history of the Anglo-American world. Here, once again, is the French historian, this time referring to Quinet's polemic against Louis Blanc. Beginning of long quote. The behavior of the British in India has been compared with the regime of 93. But where is the analogy? The world is full of violence and war. Who can doubt it? But that is not the point. Did the British generals in India kill one another? Things would have to stand thus for the comparison to be sustainable. Can we not see that one of the peculiar features of the French Revolution is that revolutionaries were put to death by revolutionaries, Jacobins by Jacobins, Montagnards by Montagnards? Why did this occur? End of long quote. And Furet piles it on, inveighing against, quote, the inability to clarify the characteristics of the social violence that has had such a long career in left-wing ideology, end quote. This is a theme dear to a massive literature and also to Arendt, for whom the French Revolution is to be regarded as a failure because it placed everything under the sign of Saturn. In truth, there is no revolutionary cycle that cannot be interpreted in accordance with this schema. Let us see what happened in the British colonies in America. The united camp that fought against the despotism of the mother country, demanding the right to independent representation, subsequently split over the issue of independence. And it is enough to glance at the Loyalist literature to observe the heartbreak with which they saw repression rain down on them. It was experienced and denounced as ferocious, and of a ferocity that was all the more inexplicable in that it was inflicted by former allies. These were the years when a ferocious saying came to be current in America, that though we are commanded to forgive our enemies, we are nowhere commanded to forgive our friends. End quote. The operative dialectic did not end with the attainment of independence. The federal constitution subsequently promulgated at Philadelphia was invoked for the purposes of confronting with adequate executive power the factional violence and civil war started by Daniel Shays, a retired colonel in the army that had fought and defeated the British, who now put himself at the head of a revolt by poor farmers and debtors in Massachusetts. This was the second division in the front that had challenged the power of George III. Obviously, however, the more profound and bloody split is the one that occurred some decades later. The forces that had defeated the Tories and Loyalists, on the one hand, and the poor farmers on the other, promulgated the new federal constitution in a kind of coup d'etat. It was marked by a compromise that allowed the southern states to continue to enjoy black slavery undisturbed. A few decades later, the same forces confronted one another in a fight to the finish, when the contradictions that had previously been smoothed over or masked by a compromise that proved unstable matured to breaking point. We can now understand why both abolitionists and supporters of slavery alike referred to the anti-British War of Independence and the declarations and constitutional texts deriving from it during the Civil War. Lincoln's followers invoked the Philadelphia Constitution, with its solemn opening in which the people of the United States declared that they wished to form a more perfect union. The literature of the Confederacy, on the other hand, laid claim to the legacy of the patriotic struggle against an oppressive central power, underscored the centrality of the rights of each single state in the process of the country's foundation and its legal tradition, and reminded the abolitionists that Washington, Jefferson, and Monroe were all slave owners. Both sides declared that they were following in the tracks laid down by the Founding Fathers. Saturn does indeed devour his children. Initiated with the anti-British rebellion, the Democratic Revolution went beyond the old constitutional compromise, no longer recognized it, could no longer recognize itself in it. The struggle was so bitter that it continued beyond the end of the Civil War. While the iron fist of the military occupation regime imposed by the Union made itself felt in the South, a counteroffensive for the restoration of white supremacy began, with the squads of the Ku Klux Klan, violence, and even a form of guerrilla warfare. In the words of a distinguished American historian, quote, "As surely as the struggle between 1861 and 65 was a civil war, so was the conflict from 1865 to 77, with as much bitterness and hatred, but less bloodshed." End quote. Denouncing the French Revolution as a Saturn that devoured its children, Furet refers to Quinet, ignoring the fact that for the latter, the relevant dialectic implicated not so much Jacobin ideology as France's enduring Catholic legacy. But we have seen how fashionable the depiction of the historical development of Protestant countries implied by this claim is. On the subject of Saturn, we may turn to Burckhardt. Examining the phenomenology of major historical crises from antiquity onwards, he summarized their general characteristics as follows. Beginning of long quote. Any man who flags for an instant, or can no longer keep pace with the increasing momentum of the movement, is replaced with astonishing rapidity. In the shortest space of time, a second generation of leaders has found time to mature, and is already representative of the crisis alone, and of its essential specific spirit. They feel their bond with the former state of things far less strongly than the men who came first. Whenever a man or a party wearies, another is waiting to take his place, and though he may, in his turn, be extremely inadequate to his moment, the whole movement may crystallize round him for just that moment. La révolution dévore ses enfants. Every stage of the crisis devours the representatives of the preceding stage as moderates. End of long quote. We can view the dialectic of Saturn with foolish amazement. However, far from being specific to Catholicism or Jacobinism, it also emerges in sharp relief in the Puritan Revolution. Beginning of long quote. In the first stage of the crisis, when the old oppressions have to be swept away and their representatives persecuted, we already find the phenomenon which causes so much foolish amazement, namely that the initiators of the movement are ousted and replaced. Either they had been the agents of very diverse forces, while from now on one force stands revealed as the real leader, annihilating the others or carrying them with it. This, for instance, was the case in the Civil War in England, which was set in motion by the Cavaliers, but carried through by the Roundheads alone, a proof that the essential impulse was not the defense of the Constitution, but the independent movement. End quote. Not only Burckhardt, but also distinguished contemporary historians stress that a process of division within the original opposition characterized the Puritan Revolution throughout. It will suffice here to refer to its final phase. In 1646, the Royalist armies had been completely defeated, and Charles I was a prisoner of the revolutionary forces. But this did not mean the end of the Civil War. A struggle between Presbyterians and Congregationalists or Independents, to whom Cromwell adhered, ensued. Having secured victory, Cromwell struck out at the more radical current of the Levelers. Thus, successive waves of division are not a peculiar feature of the French Revolution. Significantly, even before its outbreak, Herder affirmed that, given the constant upheavals in the history of governments, quote, "the greater part of our earth merits not such a name, but that of Mars or child-devouring Saturn." End quote. Even more interesting is the fact that one of the first denunciations of this dialectic is attributable to the philosophes, who ideologically paved the way for the French Revolution. Examining the Reformation and its development, They charged clerical fanaticism with reproducing in practice the abominable cult of Saturn and Moloch. In fact, the schema of Saturn is readily applicable to the decades or centuries of politico-religious struggles that arose out of the Protestant Reformation and continued until the Glorious Revolution, or even the American Revolution. Münzer started off as a follower of Luther, appreciated and loved by his teacher, who was subsequently prominent and implacable in demanding his physical elimination. It is a dialectic that assumes international dimensions, first with the Reformation and its sequels in Britain, and then with the American Revolution led by descendants of the Puritan exiles. It is no coincidence that Tucker in England characterized the rebels as the dissidents of dissent and the Protestantism of the Protestant religion. End of section.